I never imagined that exploring that abandoned church would change our lives forever, but in that moment, we were blinded by curiosity. The old church on the outskirts of town had always been shrouded in dark legends, a place everyone avoided. As a history student, I, Claire, knew that behind every myth there was a fragment of truth, something that needed to be discovered. I convinced some friends to join me in the exploration, all equally fascinated by the idea of uncovering the secrets of that mysterious place, even though we knew it was forbidden. By the time we arrived, the sun was already starting to fade, leaving the sky tinged with orange and red. The church, with its imposing Gothic architecture, looked even more sinister as the light dimmed. The broken stained glass windows and moss-covered walls made it feel like time had stopped there. "It's amazing how a place like this can be so forgotten," said Ethan, staring at the church's tilted tower. His comment, though casual, couldn't hide the nervousness creeping in among us. Something about the place deeply unsettled us. We pushed open the main door, which creaked ominously. The smell of mold and rotting would hit us immediately. The air inside the church was heavy, as if the building had absorbed decades of darkness and silence. "Are we sure we should go in?" asked one of the students, hesitating for a moment at the doorway. I was determined to move forward. "It's now or never," I replied, trying to sound confident, though my stomach churned with anticipation. There was something in the silence of the place that seemed to be waiting for us. As we ventured into the main hall, the sound of our footsteps echoed off the stone walls, as if we were being watched. The architecture, though magnificent, was in ruins. The high ceiling, once adorned with religious paintings, was now faded and cracked. The wooden pews were rotting, and the altar, which had probably once been the heart of the church, was now just a shadow of its former glory. I wondered how many people had prayed there, and how many of those prayers had been answered. The place seemed forgotten by both men and gods. Despite the grandeur of the location, there was a growing sense of unease. Something felt wrong. The wind whistled through the broken windows, making a sound that resembled whispers. "Is anyone else hearing that?" Ethan asked, glancing around with wide eyes. I didn't respond, but I could also feel the tension in the air. Maybe it was just our minds playing tricks, maybe not. Either way, we continued exploring, unaware that the real discovery was just beginning. As we explored the church, something caught Ethan's attention. At the end of a dark, damp hallway, he stopped in front of a massive wooden door, partially hidden in the shadows. "Hey, guys, look at this," he said, pointing to the door, locked with rusty chains. The old metal looked like it had been placed there long ago, as if to protect something, or someone. Silence fell over us as we all stared at the door. "What do you think's in there?" I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine. The chains, worn by time, seemed fragile, like they were on the verge of falling apart with a simple touch. Ethan, always the most curious and reckless of the group, began fiddling with the chains with his hands. "This has been here so long. It won't be hard to open," he said, ignoring the visible discomfort on everyone else's faces. We all knew breaking into the door was a bad idea, but no one objected. The desire to find out what was behind it was irresistible. We were all gripped by the same insane curiosity. After a few minutes of effort, the chains gave way with a loud snap, the sound echoing through the church walls. We looked at each other, hearts racing. "I guess there's no turning back now," one of the girls murmured, visibly nervous. Carefully, I pushed the wooden door. It creaked, as if reluctant to reveal what it was hiding. A damp, musty smell wafted out, making us recoil for a moment. "Why does it always have to smell like this?" Ethan joked, trying to break the tension. What we found behind that door was a staircase leading to a basement. Did anyone know this was here? I asked, but the truth was no one had any idea that basement existed. The lighting was minimal, and the walls were covered in moss. The air was oppressive, as if we were descending into a place that wasn't meant to be visited. Every step we took made the floor creak, and the darkness around us seemed to grow thicker. I began to feel a growing pressure in my chest, a sense that something was watching us from the shadows. When we finally reached the bottom of the stairs, we were met with a simple wooden door, very different from the one we had broken into earlier. In the center was a carved symbol, something none of us recognized. "Has anyone seen this before?" I asked, tracing my finger over the worn carving. No one answered, but the tension was palpable. With my heart racing and my palms sweating, I pushed the door open. What we saw on the other side made the air around us feel even heavier. The room was small, but what caught our attention were the walls. Ancient religious symbols were painted crudely, mixed with disturbing, almost childish drawings. In the center of the room stood an old chair, stained with what looked like dried blood. The floor around the chair was covered in dark, worn marks, as if something or someone had been dragged repeatedly. The silence among us was absolute, and the only thing I could hear was the sound of my own heart pounding. This doesn't feel right," one of the students muttered, stepping back a few paces. The air in the room was freezing, and a deep sense of unease began to creep into all of us. Something was wrong in that place, something we couldn't explain. It wasn't just the disturbing scene before us. It was the feeling that we were being watched, as if something in that room had been waiting for us. I tried to push the thought away, but I couldn't ignore the growing tension. Ethan, always the boldest, walked up to the chair in the center of the room. "Do you think someone actually used this for, I don't know, some kind of ritual?" he asked, half joking, but unable to hide his discomfort. No one responded. We were all frozen, trapped by the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to radiate from the room itself. I wanted to leave, but something kept me paralyzed. It was as if the environment was wrapping around us, trapping us in an invisible web of fear. As we tried to process what we were seeing, one of the girls pointed to a pile of papers tossed in a corner. "What's that?" she asked, her voice trembling. I walked over to the corner and carefully picked up the papers. They were old, almost crumbling at the touch, with illegible writing. "It looks like a diary," I said, slowly flipping through the pages, trying to make sense of what it all meant. Deep down, I already knew we were about to find answers we should never have sought. The moment we entered that room, something changed. It was as if the very air around us had become denser, heavier. The sense of unease began to grow inside me, almost like a pressure on my chest, making it hard to breathe. It wasn't just what we were seeing. The symbols on the walls, the blood-stained chair, the mysterious diary. It was something we couldn't see, but that was clearly there. We all felt it at the same time. "Is anyone else getting this weird feeling?" I asked, trying to hide my nerves. The entire group nodded. Even Ethan, who had been the bravest of us, started to look uneasy. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice faltering slightly. "It's just an old room. There's nothing here." But the sweat on his forehead and the way he avoided looking directly at the chair in the center of the room showed that even he was feeling the weight of that oppressive atmosphere. It wasn't just psychological fear. It was something physical, as if the place was alive somehow, reacting to our presence. Every second we spent in that room felt stretched. Time seemed to move differently, slower and more agonizing. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the more I tried to ignore the feeling, the stronger it got. What was this? What had been done in that room that left such a deep mark that even after years of abandonment, it could still fill the air with such a sinister presence? I couldn't find any answers. I just knew we needed to get out. The tension among us was growing by the minute. No one wanted to be the first to say we should leave, but it was clear everyone was thinking it. The silence was absolute, and that only made everything more disturbing. Every small movement, every breath seemed amplified. Ethan, who had been flipping through the diary, closed it abruptly. "This doesn't make any sense," he said, his voice tense. "Let's get out of here." But before we could move, a low, distant sound echoed through the room, like a sigh coming from the walls. We all froze. "Did you guys hear that?" one of the girls asked, her voice shaking. We didn't need to respond. We had all heard it. The air grew even heavier, and panic began to creep into all of us. I tried to stay calm, but my heart was racing. It was as if something invisible was surrounding us, squeezing, suffocating us slowly. This wasn't just a simple exploration anymore. Something terrible was happening, and we were at the center of it. As we tried to make sense of what was happening, Ethan picked up the diary again, now with a more serious expression. He seemed reluctant to continue reading, but but something was forcing him to move forward. "Maybe this will explain something," he said, his voice tense, turning the pages carefully. The diary was old, with faded writing and stains that looked like dried blood. As he read, the expression on his face grew darker and darker. "This isn't normal. This is," he began, but his voice trailed off. "Just say it, Ethan," I urged, growing impatient as the panic inside me built. He hesitated, looking at me with wide eyes. "This place, this room, was used for exorcisms," he finally said, his face pale. We all exchanged frightened glances. "Exorcisms?" I repeated, trying to process the information. The air around us seemed to grow heavier with every word he said. "Yeah, but it wasn't just that. They believed some people here were possessed, and they were corrected." The words came out slowly, as if they were too heavy for him to bear. My mind began to spin. "Corrected?" I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine. Ethan nodded. "That's what it says here. They would lock people down here and perform rituals to purify them. If they survived, they were set free. If not..." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Whatever had happened in that room had left deep marks, not just on the walls or the floor, but in the very atmosphere. It was as if the evil they had tried to exorcise was still there, waiting. With every page Ethan read, the horror grew. There were detailed descriptions of the exorcism sessions, of the screams, of the days people spent locked in the basement. Everything was recorded with disturbing coldness. The diary wasn't just a recounting. It was a manual of torture disguised as purification. Why would anyone leave this here? I asked, more to myself than to the others. It didn't make sense. If the community believed those rituals were so sacred, why would they abandon everything like this? The tension in the group was reaching a breaking point. "We need to get out of here," one of the girls said, her voice almost panicked. I couldn't disagree. The environment around us seemed to be growing more hostile by the minute. It was as if the walls were closing in on us, and the air was getting thicker by the second. We were trapped in a place that should never have been opened, and the sense of imminent danger was overwhelming. The atmosphere in the room became even more oppressive after Ethan read the contents of the diary. We all felt as if the air was becoming denser, almost impossible to breathe. "We need to get out of here," one of the girls said, and we all silently agreed, shaken by what we had just discovered. Without hesitation, we headed for the door we had come through, but when we tried to open it, it wouldn't budge. The handle turned, but the door remained firmly shut, as if it were being held closed by something invisible. "This can't be happening," Ethan murmured, pulling the handle hard, but nothing happened. Panic began to spread quickly among us. There was no reason for the door to be locked, especially without a key or padlock. It was as if the place itself was trapping us, as if we were dealing with something far beyond human comprehension. "Let me try," another student said, forcing the door, but the result was the same. The door wouldn't give. The tension was palpable. Everyone's breathing was fast, and the panic in the air was almost tangible. What had once seemed like a curious exploration was quickly turning into a nightmare. "Are we trapped?" I asked, more to myself than to the others. My heart was racing, and each passing second felt like an enormous weight pressing down on us. No one answered. The expressions on everyone's faces were of pure fear. We tried to stay calm, but the feeling that something was terribly wrong was growing in all of us. "Let's try the window," Ethan suggested, pointing to a small opening in the corner of the room. But even as we approached, we realized it would be impossible to fit through. It was too small and too high up to be a viable escape. Besides, it didn't seem like the solution to the real problem. Whatever was keeping us in there wasn't physical. It was as if an invisible force was controlling the place, keeping us trapped inside the room. Fear began to take over. The lights from the flashlights we had brought started to flicker, dimming slightly, adding to the discomfort. It was as if the room was alive, responding to our fear, feeding off of it. "This isn't normal," one of the students said, his voice trembling. Every minute that passed, the feeling that we were being watched grew stronger. Something or someone was in there with us, and we were no longer alone. The silence in the room was broken by a sound that made everyone's heart stop for a second. Scratching. Sharp, Repetitive sounds began to echo from outside the locked door. At first, they were subtle, like something lightly scraping the surface of the wood, but they soon became more intense, more desperate. We all froze where we stood, our eyes fixed on the door. "What is that?" someone whispered, but no one had the courage to answer. Panic was taking hold. The scratching continued, now louder, as if something was trying to force its way inside. The sound was unmistakable, nails scratching against wood, frantic and disturbing. This can't be happening," Ethan said, backing away, his eyes wide with fear. The sound of something trying to enter the room only increased the sense of terror, and the idea that we were being hunted, trapped like prey waiting for something, was becoming more and more real. My mind was racing, trying to understand what was happening. We tried to convince ourselves it could be the wind, or maybe rats, but deep down, we all knew the truth. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't rats. It was something we couldn't explain, something we never should have disturbed. The room seemed smaller by the minute, and the fear that the door would be broken down at any second kept us frozen in place. The lights from the flashlights flickered again, almost going out completely, and the cold around us seemed to increase, as if the room was sucking all the heat and life away. "We need to get out of here," one of the students shouted, his voice filled with desperation. He ran to the door and started pounding on it, hoping somehow that would help. But the scratching from the other side only intensified, accompanied by a deeper sound, as if something was pushing against the wood with force. "Someone's out there," he yelled, but deep down, we all knew it wasn't someone. It was something that shouldn't be there. Panic took over the group. We were cornered. There was nowhere to run, and the fear that something was about to break into the room was overwhelming. My mind was racing, trying to think of a way out, but the sound of the scratching was like a clock, counting down to something terrible. I had never felt so helpless in my life. The only thought running through my mind was that we needed to get out of there, but the door wouldn't open, and the scratching continued. When the door finally opened, there was no time to think, only to act. The panic that had kept us frozen in the room now turned into pure adrenaline. We ran as if our lives depended on it, stumbling up the basement stairs with clumsy urgency. The sound of our footsteps echoed far too loudly for my liking, but I didn't dare look back. Something was following us. I could feel it. The sensation of being hunted was almost unbearable. Every cell in my body screamed to get out of there as fast as possible. We raced through the ruined hallway of the church, our flashlights flickering weakly, as if even the light was losing the battle against the darkness surrounding us. Ethan was ahead, forcing the front door open with desperate strength. The cold night air hit us like a blast when we finally got out. But even as the wind hit our faces, the sense of relief was only temporary. The fear was still there, lodged inside us, just like the darkness of that room. We ran down the path back to town, our footsteps echoing in the silence of the forest. No one looked back, no one spoke. We were all in a state of silent shock, our hearts racing and our minds trying to process what we had just experienced. The dark mystery of the church followed us like an invisible shadow. Whatever had been in that basement was locked away for a reason, and we, in our reckless curiosity, had disturbed something that should never have been awakened. When we finally reached the safety of the town's lit streets, we stopped, panting and sweating. The entire group was silent, looking at each other with expressions of pure terror. We knew we had physically left the church, but what had we brought back with us? The fear that something invisible, something incomprehensible, was still watching us didn't leave anyone. The feeling that we had crossed an invisible line was overwhelming, and no one dared to mention what we were all thinking. What exactly had let us leave that room? After that night, none of us ever spoke about the church or what we found there again. We tried to move on with our lives, but the weight of that experience was always present, even if never mentioned. We knew, deep down, that we had escaped something far bigger than we could understand. That church still stands there, with its secrets, its dark symbols, and its malevolent presence, waiting for other curious souls. And us? We now live with the burden of knowing that some places were never meant to be disturbed. I just wanted a bit of peace. But as I crossed the rusted gate of that church, I realized I should never have come here. My name is Lucas, and I'm an amateur photographer. After weeks of feeling uninspired, I decided to hit the road in search of something different, something that might reignite my passion for photography. But from the moment I saw that decaying church, something inside me screamed to turn back. Still, there was a force drawing me in, as if that forgotten structure had been waiting for me. I parked my car in the shade of dead trees, their twisted silhouettes like sinister guardians of the place. The field around was deserted, with only weeds choking the church's entrance. The broken stained glass reflected the last glow of the setting sun, while statues of saints, deformed by time, silently watched me. I'd photographed abandoned places before, but this one, there was something different, something unsettling. My camera, hanging around my neck, swayed slightly as I walked. Photography had always been my escape, a way to turn the world around me into something manageable. But now, as I approached the entrance, I felt a nervousness I couldn't ignore. I pushed open the main door, and the sharp sound of rusty metal echoed off the walls like a warning scream. The smell of mold and rotting wood filled my lungs, while the heavy air of the church seemed to wrap around me. For a moment, I stood still, staring at the dark interior. Something was wrong with this place, but I kept going. The crumbling altar, the rotting pews, and the dust hanging in the air created a scene that begged to be captured through the lens. Each click of the camera seemed to echo in the emptiness, as if disturbing something that should remain silent. I knew I should feel excited about the photos I was taking, but all I felt was discomfort. The search for peace had brought me here, but as I moved further down the nave of the church, a question began to grow in my mind. Had I found this place, or had it found me? The shadows inside the church seemed to come to life, stretching out like invisible hands that followed me with every step. As I approached the altar, something began to seriously unsettle me. There were signs that I wasn't the only one who had been here recently, and that sent a chill down my spine. Partially melted candles were scattered on the floor, some of them with traces of fresh wax, as if they had been extinguished not too long ago. I stopped and crouched down to take a closer look. It didn't make sense. This place had been abandoned for years, maybe decades, and the decaying state of the walls confirmed that. But there, in the middle of all the ruin, were these small signs of recent activity. My first thought was that maybe another curious soul, like me, had been here. Perhaps another photographer or explorer. But the way the candles were carefully arranged around the altar, and the scattered old prayer leaflets on the ground, suggested something different. It was as if this place was being used for some kind of secret ceremony, something no one was meant to witness. The discomfort in me grew, but my curiosity wouldn't let me turn back. I needed to understand what was happening here. My mind tried to rationalize the situation, but the oppressive silence of the church contradicted any logical explanation. The feeling of being watched intensified, as if something invisible lurked in the shadows. I looked around, trying to locate the source of my unease, but everything seemed still, inert. I kept taking photos, trying to focus on my work. As I captured the decay of the building, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was intruding on something sacred, or perhaps something profane. Each click of the camera echoed unnaturally, as if the sound didn't belong in a place like this. The light streaming through the broken windows cast distorted shadows that didn't make sense, and with each shot, I wondered if what I saw through the lens was real or just my mind playing tricks on me. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Near the altar, there were strange marks on the floor, as if heavy furniture had been dragged recently. The scratch marks formed a pattern I couldn't immediately understand, but what unsettled me most was the realization that the dust was more dispersed there, as if someone had cleaned that area not long ago. None of it made sense. The church was abandoned, yet it seemed like someone was still using it. And the question that echoed in my mind was, who? I glanced toward the door, considering leaving before something worse happened, but some invisible force kept me there. What had initially seemed like a simple exploration of a forgotten place had now become a mystery I couldn't ignore. I tried to focus on my photography, but the thought that there was something more in that place consumed me. Something, or someone, was there, and I had to find out what it was. I decided to approach the altar, drawn by something that caught my attention. The deteriorating environment gave the impression that nothing in this place had been touched for years, but as I got closer, I saw something that contrasted with the decay. An old Bible, open, rested on the altar, its pages yellowed and fragile. It wasn't the presence of the book that bothered me, but the fact that several passages were underlined in red, as if someone had been studying it recently, and the content of those markings sent an immediate chill down my spine. I cautiously approached, feeling the cold intensify as I read the underlined words. The passages spoke of sacrifices, divine punishment, and rituals. It seemed more like a preparation for something dark than any typical religious practice. The book was marked on specific pages, all related to trials and offerings. My mind began to piece together an even more disturbing scenario. What if this church wasn't truly abandoned? What if it was being used by some kind of cult? With each word I read, the more uncomfortable I became with the idea that I had crossed an invisible line by entering here. My presence felt like an affront to something greater, something the walls of this church still held. I took a deep breath and stepped back, trying to shake off the sinister thoughts, but the feeling that something was watching me grew stronger. The Bible remained open, exposed, as if inviting me to go further. But the discomfort in my chest was almost physical now, and I decided I had seen enough. Still, before leaving, I took one last photo of the altar. The camera's click sounded louder than before, and in that moment, something changed. The air seemed denser, and the shadows around me stretched, as if they had a life of their own. I should have left right then, but my curiosity kept me there. I was both fascinated and terrified. The markings in the Bible wouldn't leave my mind, and I kept wondering, who had made them, and why those specific passages? The place was starting to reveal secrets I wasn't prepared to uncover. I decided to take one last walk around the church, trying to shake off the growing fear. The photos I had taken were impressive, but the discomfort wouldn't leave me. Something was wrong. I felt that this church was more than just a backdrop for good pictures. It was a place where something dark had happened, or was still about to happen. I just wanted a bit of peace, but as I crossed the rusted gate of that church, I realized I should never have come here. My name is Lucas, and I'm an amateur photographer. After weeks of feeling uninspired, I decided to hit the road in search of something different, something that might reignite my passion for photography. But from the moment I saw that decaying church, something inside me screamed to turn back. Still, there was a force drawing me in, as if that forgotten structure had been waiting for me. I parked my car in the shade of dead trees, their twisted silhouettes like sinister guardians of the place. The field around was deserted, with only weeds choking the church's entrance. The broken stained glass reflected the last glow of the setting sun, while statues of saints, deformed by time, silently watched me. I'd photographed abandoned places before, but this one, there was something different, something unsettling. My camera, hanging around my neck, swayed slightly as I walked. Photography had always been my escape, a way to turn the world around me into something manageable. But now, as I approached the entrance, I felt a nervousness I couldn't ignore. I pushed open the main door, and the sharp sound of rusty metal echoed off the walls like a warning scream. The smell of mold and rotting wood filled my lungs, while the heavy air of the church seemed to wrap around me. For a moment, I stood still, staring at the dark interior. Something was wrong with this place, but I kept going. The crumbling altar, the rotting pews, and the dust hanging in the air created a scene that begged to be captured through the lens. Each click of the camera seemed to echo in the emptiness, as if disturbing something that should remain silent. I knew I should feel excited about the photos I was taking, but all I felt was discomfort. The search for peace had brought me here, but as I moved further down the nave of the church, a question began to grow in my mind. Had I found this place, or had it found me? The shadows inside the church seemed to come to life, stretching out like invisible hands that followed me with every step. As I approached the altar, something began to seriously unsettle me. There were signs that I wasn't the only one who had been here recently, and that sent a chill down my spine. Partially melted candles were scattered on the floor, some of them with traces of fresh wax, as if they had been extinguished not too long ago. I stopped and crouched down to take a closer look. It didn't make sense. This place had been abandoned for years, maybe decades, and the decaying state of the walls confirmed that. But there, in the middle of all the ruin, were these small signs of recent activity. My first thought was that maybe another curious soul, like me, had been here. Perhaps another photographer or explorer. But the way the candles were carefully arranged around the altar, and the scattered old prayer leaflets on the ground, suggested something different. It was as if this place was being used for some kind of secret ceremony, something no one was meant to witness. The discomfort in me grew, but my curiosity wouldn't let me turn back. I needed to understand what was happening here. My mind tried to rationalize the situation, but the oppressive silence of the church contradicted any logical explanation. The feeling of being watched intensified, as if something invisible lurked in the shadows. I looked around, trying to locate the source of my unease, but everything seemed still, inert. I kept taking photos, trying to focus on my work. As I captured the decay of the building, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was intruding on something sacred, or perhaps something profane. Each click of the camera echoed unnaturally, as if the sound didn't belong in a place like this. The light streaming through the broken windows cast distorted shadows that didn't make sense, and with each shot, I wondered if what I saw through the lens was real or just my mind playing tricks on me. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Near the altar, there were strange marks on the floor, as if heavy furniture had been dragged recently. The scratch marks formed a pattern I couldn't immediately understand, but what unsettled me most was the realization that the dust was more dispersed there, as if someone had cleaned that area not long ago. None of it made sense. The church was abandoned, yet it seemed like someone was still using it. And the question that echoed in my mind was, who? I glanced toward the door, considering leaving before something worse happened. But some invisible force kept me there. What had initially seemed like a simple exploration of a forgotten place had now become a mystery I couldn't ignore. I tried to focus on my photography, but the thought that there was something more in that place consumed me. Something, or someone, was there, and I had to find out what it was. I decided to approach the altar, drawn by something that caught my attention. The deteriorating environment gave the impression that nothing in this place had been touched for years, but as I got closer, I saw something that contrasted with the decay. An old Bible, open, rested on the altar, its pages yellowed and fragile. It wasn't the presence of the book that bothered me, but the fact that several passages were underlined in red, as if someone had been studying it recently, and the content of those markings sent an immediate chill down my spine. I cautiously approached, feeling the cold intensify as I read the underlined words. The passages spoke of sacrifices, divine punishment, and rituals. It seemed more like a preparation for something dark than any typical religious practice. The book was marked on specific pages, all related to trials and offerings. My mind began to piece together an even more disturbing scenario. What if this church wasn't truly abandoned? What if it was being used by some kind of cult? With each word I read, the more uncomfortable I became with the idea that I had crossed an invisible line by entering here. My presence felt like an affront to something greater, something the walls of this church still held. I took a deep breath and stepped back, trying to shake off the sinister thoughts, but the feeling that something was watching me grew stronger. The Bible remained open, exposed, as if inviting me to go further. But the discomfort in my chest was almost physical now, and I decided I had seen enough. Still, before leaving, I took one last photo of the altar. The camera's click sounded louder than before, and in that moment, something changed. The air seemed denser, and the shadows around me stretched, as if they had a life of their own. I should have left right then, but my curiosity kept me there. I was both fascinated and terrified. The markings in the Bible wouldn't leave my mind, and I kept wondering, who had made them, and why those specific passages? The place was starting to reveal secrets I wasn't prepared to uncover. I decided to take one last walk around the church, trying to shake off the growing fear. The photos I had taken were impressive, but the discomfort wouldn't leave me. Something was wrong. I felt that this church was more than just a backdrop for good pictures. It was a place where something dark had happened, or was still about to happen. As I walked toward the door, Feeling the weight of the place on my shoulders, an even more disturbing sensation took hold of me. I was no longer alone. When I looked up at the broken stained glass windows, I saw shadows. They were figures, or at least their silhouettes, motionless, watching me from outside. Paralyzed, I blinked a few times, hoping my mind was playing tricks on me, but they were still there. They were outlines, undefined forms, just watching, and the air around me grew heavier. For a second, I stood frozen, as if fear had glued my feet to the ground. The figures remained in the windows, silent, just standing still, like shadows trapped in the broken glass. I took a deep breath and tried to calm my mind, convincing myself they were just reflections of the trees or the moonlight filtering through the stained glass. But something deep down told me this wasn't just a trick of the light. I could feel that I was being watched, and it wasn't just my imagination. I took a few steps back, trying to distance myself from the windows, but the eyes, or whatever those figures were, seemed to follow me. With each movement I made, the shadows seemed to shift, surrounding me without moving. The corrupted statues around me, which had been mere ruins moments before, now felt like part of something larger, a silent vigil of a ritual I had interrupted. My hands began to tremble, and the idea that I was in danger took root deep in my mind. Even with fear growing inside me, I tried to rationalize the situation. Maybe it was just shadows from the trees, some play of light. But why did I feel like something was lurking, just waiting for the right moment to act? I felt like prey being watched, evaluated, tested. Everything in me screamed to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. This church, once just an abandoned place, now seemed alive, and I didn't know how to escape. I decided to back away slowly. I didn't want to turn my back on those shadows. I grabbed my camera like an anchor to reality, trying to focus on the clicks and the details visible through the lens, but nothing reassured me. The feeling of being watched intensified. The figures in the windows remained still, but I knew they were there for a reason. It was as if they were guarding something, or waiting for me. With my heart racing, I realized I needed to get out of there as fast as possible. But as I prepared to run, I realized the shadows in the windows weren't there by accident. Something was waiting for me, and leaving wouldn't be as simple as I thought. With fear pulsing through my veins and my breath heavy, I decided I had spent too much time in that church. I needed to leave immediately. The place seemed to have transformed around me, each shadow a warning, each sound a sign that I was out of place. I began to walk toward the door, trying to keep calm, but with each step I took, the air seemed to become denser, more oppressive. That's when I realized something even more disturbing. As I turned to take one last look inside the church, I saw movement. I was no longer alone. There, among the rows of rotting pews, silent figures began to emerge. At first, they seemed like confused shadows, but soon they became clear. They were people. They stood still, motionless, staring at me with vacant, expressionless eyes. They wore old-fashioned clothes, long dresses, formal attire, as if they were attendees of a long-forgotten mass. My body froze for a few seconds. They didn't move, didn't make a sound. They just stared at me with a cold intensity, as if I were an intruder that needed to be dealt with. This didn't make sense. The church was abandoned. There was no one else there but me. Or at least, that's what I thought. Now, those anonymous faces, with rigid and lifeless expressions, were all turned toward me, as if they were waiting for something or someone. Instinctively, I took a step back, trying to avoid their gaze. Each figure seemed out of place, as if trapped in time. I didn't know if I was hallucinating, or if the environment had really changed this way. Everything felt surreal, as if the air was filled with an ancient, heavy, and dangerous energy. But what terrified me the most was the silence. They didn't say anything, didn't make any move. They just watched, as if waiting for me to react. Panic began to take hold of me. I needed to leave, but something in me hesitated, as if running would give them exactly what they wanted. The figures didn't advance, but their gaze was unbearable. Every second I spent there, I felt myself sinking deeper into the darkness of that church. Sweat dripped down my forehead. My breathing was fast and irregular. I needed to make a decision, run or stay. Then a terrifying thought formed in my mind. involuntary and chilling. These people weren't normal. They were from another time. They seemed to be part of something old, some ritual that shouldn't have been interrupted. And I was the intruder. Fear paralyzed me, but I knew I needed to leave. Every moment I spent there felt wrong, as if time itself was out of place. In a desperate move, I hid behind one of the columns along the side of the church, trying to escape the view of the motionless congregation. My heart was pounding so hard I feared they might hear it. But when I peeked again, I realized something even more disturbing was happening. They were starting to move. Slowly, each figure positioned itself in front of the altar, as if they were preparing for something. The absolute silence remained, which only made the scene more eerie. I crouched down even further, trying not to be seen, but my morbid curiosity kept me from running. The figures, now gathered before the altar, began to reenact what looked like a mass, but something was wrong. The words that came from their mouths were distorted, incomprehensible, as if they were speaking a language I had never heard before. And then I realized, this wasn't a normal mass. What they were doing wasn't sacred. It was a ritual, and something about it told me I wasn't supposed to be witnessing it. I tried to remain as quiet as possible as the figures moved in unison, as if every step had been meticulously rehearsed. They murmured disjointed words, and their gestures were methodical, calculated, as if they were following an ancient set of rules. The air around me felt even heavier, as if something invisible was about to happen. My instincts screamed for me to leave, but I couldn't take my eyes off the scene unfolding. As the ritual continued, I noticed something even more sinister. The statues around the church seemed to be watching as well. Their carved expressions, once harmless, now seemed to come to life, as if they were absorbing the energy of the ceremony. I knew something terrible was happening, something old and profane. My body wanted to run, but my mind was hypnotized by the vision before me. Every movement of the figures at the altar seemed to provoke a growing sense of dread. Finally, when I thought I couldn't bear it any longer, a strange sound began to echo through the church. It was a low whisper, coming from all corners at once. There was no clear source, but I could feel that I was surrounded. The words of the whispers were just as distorted as those of the ritual, but there was something in them that made me feel an unbearable pressure on my chest. It was as if the very atmosphere was closing in around me, forcing me to stay and watch whatever was about to happen. My mind began to race with possibilities. This group, the ritual, the oppressive silence, none of it seemed to belong to the real world. I was witnessing something that was never meant to be seen, an ancient secret guarded for generations, and I, an accidental intruder, had discovered it. But whatever it was, I knew I couldn't stay to find out how it ended. I prepared to run. The fear of being discovered was now overwhelming. My muscles were tense, ready to sprint, when I realized something was wrong. One of the congregation members had seen me. There was no scream, no alarm. He simply turned his head toward me, and for a freezing moment, our eyes met. A cold chill ran through my body like an electric shock. His gaze was empty, devoid of any humanity, but it carried an immense force, a silent command that I shouldn't be there. I tried to back away slowly, but as soon as I did, the entire group of worshippers began to move in unison. As if they were extensions of one another, they slowly turned toward me, their expressionless faces locked on me. The muffled sound of their footsteps echoed on the stone floor of the church, and despite the slowness of their movements, there was a cold intention in each step. They weren't in a hurry. They didn't need to be. I was the intruder, and they knew there was nowhere to run. My feet felt heavy, as if the air around me had thickened and was holding me in place. The sight of those figures slowly surrounding me, without saying a word, filled me with paralyzing panic. I needed to act, but fear immobilized me. The group advanced from all sides, encircling me with a precision that felt rehearsed. My thoughts were in turmoil, and I could only think of one thing. I needed to escape before it was too late. With my heart pounding, I tried to back away, but the space around me seemed to be shrinking. The worshippers continued their silent approach, coming closer with a calmness that only made my panic grow. The sound of whispers returned, echoing off the church walls, as if the building itself was pressing in to trap me there with them. Desperation began to suffocate me, and the only way out I saw was along the side of the church, where there was a row of broken windows. In a desperate move, I decided to run toward the nearest window. The worshippers didn't quicken their pace, but it felt as if the church was conspiring to keep me there, the shadows growing longer with every second. With one last burst of strength, I ran as fast as I could, leaping over debris and trying not to look at the figures that were now getting closer. I needed to escape before it was too late. Fear propelled me as I ran toward the broken window. The shattered glass reflected the little light that filtered in, but I didn't care about the risks anymore. It was my only chance to get out of that place, and I knew that if I didn't act at that moment, I'd never have another opportunity. My feet slipped on the moss-covered stone floor as panic set in, but I managed to keep my balance. With one final effort, I lunged toward the window, feeling the shards of glass tear into my skin. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but it was a welcome relief. I was outside. My heart was still racing, but I couldn't stop. Something told me the danger wasn't over yet. I ran across the field, the sound of the wind in the dry tree branches mixing with the echo of the whispers that seemed to follow me. I didn't dare look back, afraid I'd see those motionless figures watching me through the broken window. All that mattered was putting as much distance between me and that church as possible. My lungs burned and my legs felt weak as I ran, but the panic kept me moving. What I had witnessed inside wasn't from this world. Those people, or whatever they were, belonged to another time, another reality, and I was the intruder. The open field felt endless, and with every step, I felt like those figures were following me, as if the unfinished ritual still depended on me in some way. Finally, when I reached my car, my hands were trembling so badly I could barely unlock the door. I got in, slammed the door shut, and locked all the doors, as if that could protect me from something so ancient and immaterial. I started the engine and sped off, the dirt road shaking the car as I drove as fast as I could. But even far from the church, the fear persisted. The silence of the field around me felt like a warning that the nightmare was far from over. The feeling of being followed wouldn't leave me. I glanced in the rearview mirror several times, expecting to see something or someone coming toward me. Nothing, but the emptiness terrified me even more. What I had witnessed in that church would stay with me forever, and I knew that no matter how far I ran, the memory of that place wouldn't leave me. The fear, the whispers, the figures in the windows, they were part of something much bigger than I could ever understand. Even when I got home, I still felt like I wasn't alone. The nightmare would follow me wherever I went, and I knew that church and its worshippers from another time would always be lurking, waiting for the right moment to find me again. The place seemed tailor-made for them, but soon Alice felt they weren't as alone as they thought. Mark and I were eager for our pre-wedding photo shoot, and the idea of doing it in an abandoned church sounded like something unique and perfect. The photographer suggested a well-known location famous for its Gothic architecture, a church forgotten by time, and of course, we loved the idea. The ruins had a dramatic air. The still intact stained glass cast soft colors across the dark atmosphere, creating a melancholic beauty. It seemed like the ideal setting for the bold and artistic photos we wanted. When we arrived, I was immediately drawn to the grandeur of the building. Even in its decaying state, the church held undeniable beauty. The tall columns and stained glass windows, which had somehow survived years of abandonment, reflected the late afternoon light with a mixture of shadows and colors. It was perfect. Mark and I wandered around as the photographer adjusted his equipment. The silence of the church was almost reverent, as if time had stopped there. I was excited for the shoot, while Mark, always practical, inspected every corner with curious eyes. I was captivated by the mysterious air that lingered. The place had a certain magnetism, something that seemed to call out to us. But for a moment, I felt a chill down my neck, as if something invisible was watching. I turned, but everything was quiet. I shrugged it off, blaming it on nerves. As we walked down the main aisle toward the altar, I felt like we were exploring a piece of the past, a place full of stories. "This place is really perfect," I said to Mark, smiling. He hugged me, agreeing, while the photographer snapped a few candid shots, capturing that light-hearted moment. Everything seemed to be going just as planned, but I couldn't shake the slight feeling of unease that surfaced every now and then. I took a deep breath and refocused on the session, determined to enjoy the moment. After all, this was just an abandoned ruin, and nothing but old walls and buried memories remained here. Or at least, that's what I thought. While the photographer adjusted his lens, searching for the best angle to capture the light filtering through the stained glass, I began to wander around the altar, my eyes scanning the surroundings. That's when I noticed something lying on the ground, wedged between the cracks in the marble. A wedding veil, old and dirty, lay crumpled at the foot of the altar, as if it had been forgotten there for years. The fabric was yellowed, torn in places, but still held a tragic beauty. I smiled and bent down to pick it up. The idea of finding a veil in a place like this seemed strangely fitting, almost poetic. I glanced at Mark, who was distracted, chatting with the photographer, and decided it would be funny to play with the situation. "Hey, what do you think of this?" I asked, shaking the veil and placing it on my head, adjusting it as best as I could. The torn ends draped over my shoulders, but it still fit almost perfectly. Mark laughed when he saw me, shaking his head with an amused expression. "Now we're really in the mood," he joked, as the photographer also chuckled, enjoying my spontaneity. "It's very authentic," said the photographer, adjusting his camera to capture a few shots with the veil. The light-hearted laughter and relaxed atmosphere made me forget the strange feeling I had when we first entered the church. For a moment, I felt an odd connection to the veil, as if it carried a story. It was a difficult feeling to explain, but I quickly brushed the thought aside. I was just having fun, trying to add a special and nostalgic touch to the photos. As I posed for the first few shots with the veil, I felt that it added something even more dramatic to the scene. But as the photographer clicked away, the weight of the veil on my head began to feel different. It was as if the old fabric was clinging to my skin, heavier than before. I shook my head, trying to rid myself of the sensation, while Mark and the photographer kept laughing. I forced a smile and carried on, unaware that the garment carried more than just the weight of time. With the old veil still on my head, the photo session finally began. The photographer, ever the professional, guided us through the dusty corridors and in front of the stained glass windows, which cast a soft, colorful glow over us. The contrast between the Gothic beauty of the church and the decayed atmosphere was exactly what we wanted for the photos. Mark, always cheerful, struck relaxed poses, trying to make me laugh. I felt connected to the moment, but from time to time, a shiver ran down my spine, as if something or someone was watching. As the photographer snapped away, I started to notice that he seemed distracted. He looked at the camera's screen with a strange expression, as if something was bothering him. Even so, he kept taking photos, but with every pause, he stared at the screen, frowning, as if trying to understand what he was seeing. "Is everything okay?" I asked, trying to break the growing silence. He smiled quickly, but it seemed forced. Yes, just adjusting the light. "Nothing to worry about," he replied, though his voice sounded tense. The session continued, with Mark hugging me and joking to distract me. But with each new pose, I felt the atmosphere around us grow heavier. The air seemed denser, colder, as if the church itself was changing as time passed. The veil on my head still felt heavier than it should, and I began to feel a slight pressure on my head, as if the fabric was wrapping around me more than usual. When I touched the veil, I noticed it felt damp, which didn't make any sense. I took it off for a moment, shaking my head, but quickly put it back on, determined to finish the photos. Mark, always carefree, didn't seem to notice the tension in the air. He laughed, cracked jokes, and posed as if nothing was wrong. But the photographer continued to act strangely, checking the camera screen more and more frequently. The discomfort was palpable now, as if something invisible was moving around us, watching, waiting. With each photo taken, the feeling that we weren't alone grew stronger, but no one wanted to admit it. The photos were turning out amazing, I was sure of it, but what had started as mild discomfort was now becoming something deeper and more unsettling. Something about this church was off, and I could feel it. Even so, I said nothing. I didn't want to ruin the moment, but the sense that something was watching us wouldn't leave me in peace. As we prepared for the final set of photos, the photographer stepped away for a moment to review some of the images on his screen. I immediately noticed his expression change. He stood completely still, his eyes fixed on the camera screen. The reassuring smile he had used to put us at ease was gone, replaced by confusion and, perhaps, fear. He glanced quickly at me, then back at the camera, as if trying to understand what he was seeing. Curious, I approached and asked, "Is something wrong with the photos?" It took him a second to respond, and when he did, his voice was shaky. "It's just some distortion. Probably the light." But the look on his face said otherwise. He hesitated for a moment, then showed me the screen. The image showed Mark and me in front of the altar, the veil floating slightly around me, and in the background, there was something else. A pale, blurred figure stood near one of the pillars at the back of the church, and what sent chills down my spine was that it was staring directly at me. I frowned, trying to make sense of it. That's strange. Maybe it's a reflection or something with the lens? I suggested, my voice trembling as I spoke. The photographer nodded automatically, but he didn't seem convinced. He continued flipping through the photos, and in several of them, the figure appeared again, always in the corners, always blurred, but always looking in my direction. I tried not to show how unsettled I was, but the truth was that my stomach was churning. Mark, who had been distracted until then, noticed the tense silence between us and came over, curious. "What's up? Something wrong with the photos?" The photographer hesitated, not wanting to alarm us, and just shook his head, saying, "No, just some adjustments needed. Nothing to worry about." Mark shrugged, as carefree as ever, and went back to making jokes to distract me. But I couldn't stop thinking about that figure. It was there, in the shadows, watching, and the more I thought about it, the harder it was to ignore the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Trying to push the thoughts aside, we resumed posing for the final photos. However, each click of the camera seemed to echo louder, and every time the photographer looked at the screen, his discomfort grew. I knew he was seeing more of that figure, but he was trying to spare us the truth. Something was watching us in that church, and it wasn't just my imagination. With every new pose, the feeling of unease intensified. The photographer kept taking photos, but I could see the weight in his eyes. He avoided looking directly at me, and with each click, I knew he was seeing something he didn't want to share. The figure kept appearing in the photos, and now it was getting closer. Even without seeing the images, I could feel its presence. Deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong, but I forced myself to keep going, trying to convince myself that it was all just a technical issue, a distortion of the light, or a flaw in the camera. The photographer, however, couldn't hide his nervousness. He adjusted the camera settings over and over, as if trying to convince himself it was a problem he could fix. When he finally stopped to review the photos again, the truth became impossible to ignore. The figure was no longer blurred. Now, in one of the most recent images, it appeared clearly behind me, near the altar, staring intently. Its skin was as pale as porcelain, and its eyes, deep and empty, were fixed on me, as if trying to see through the lens. What terrified me the most was realizing that, in every photo, this presence never looked at Mark, only at me. I tried to hide the fear that was overtaking me, but the photographer couldn't ignore it any longer. He pulled me aside, keeping his voice low so Mark wouldn't hear. "Alice, I don't know what's going on, but there's something in the photos, and it's not just a lighting effect. This person, or whatever it is showing up in all the images, and it's getting closer to you. Not to Mark, just to you." I froze. What he was saying confirmed what I had already felt, but hearing it out loud made it all more real, more terrifying. I looked at the photos again and felt a cold knot form in my stomach. Every image contained that pale presence, clearer, sharper. It was coming closer to me, and the tension in the church was palpable, as if the walls had begun to close in. I wanted to leave immediately, but the session wasn't over yet, and Mark seemed so calm, so unaware of what was happening. I decided not to tell him about the photos. I didn't want to ruin the moment, and part of me still hoped everything could be explained logically. But the feeling that we were being watched grew stronger by the minute, and I knew that soon, something more sinister might happen. After the session ended, Mark, the photographer, and I sat down to review some of the images on the laptop. I still couldn't shake the memory of the figure in the photos, but I tried to stay calm, as if nothing was wrong. As the photographer adjusted the photos and showed us the best shots, Mark decided to look up some information about the church, curious about its history. We were all exhausted, and it seemed like a harmless distraction until his search revealed something disturbing. Mark, staring at his phone, went silent for a moment before slowly lifting his head. "Alice, you're not going to believe what I found," he said, using a tone I wasn't used to hearing, serious and concerned. The photographer stopped adjusting the photos, and we all turned to Mark, waiting for his discovery. "Many years ago, there was a wedding here. But it wasn't a normal wedding." He began to read, his voice filling the empty church. The bride mysteriously disappeared before she could say her vows. She vanished, literally, minutes before the ceremony was set to begin. No one ever found out what happened to her, and her body was never recovered. The church was abandoned shortly after. I felt my blood run cold. The missing bride, and the veil I had found at the altar. My mind started to make connections I didn't want to accept. The dirty veil I had worn as a joke was perhaps the last remnant of that woman. I looked at the photographer, who was no longer trying to hide his unease. "Do you think that figure in the photos?" I asked, my voice trembling. He nodded silently. The atmosphere inside the church seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. It was as if the air was becoming impossible to breathe, and the walls, once so imposing and beautiful, now closed in on me. The echo of Mark's story still rang in my mind. The bride was never found, and now, after all these years, was she coming back, trying to reach me? My heart began to race. Mark, always the skeptic, tried to maintain a rational outlook. "It's probably just a coincidence," he said, but his voice wavered. The photographer, however, couldn't hide his fear. "Coincidence or not, this church carries something, and I don't think we should have disturbed it," he said, quickly closing the laptop. We all knew that this wasn't just a simple joke. Something deeper, something older, was behind this story. At that moment, I felt a shiver run down my spine, and I knew that the figure in the photos, that pale woman, wasn't done with what she had started, and somehow I was involved now. In the days following the photo session, something changed. My mind was haunted by the presence of that figure, and at night, the rest I longed for quickly turned into nightmares. Every time I closed my eyes, there she was, a pale woman, draped in a veil, her face obscured, whispering words I couldn't understand. It was always the same dream. The figure approached slowly, her feet never touching the ground. She floated, as if trapped between this world and another. And every time she came close enough, I heard her voice. "I never finished what I started." The words were like a distant echo, but they weighed heavily on my mind. I would wake up drenched in sweat, gasping for air, my heart racing, and the terrifying feeling that someone was watching me, always watching me. Waking up in the middle of the night with the sensation of eyes on me was unbearable. I looked around, trying to convince myself that I was alone, but the presence lingered. It was as if she was there, waiting for the right moment. I tried to hide from Mark how much it was affecting me, but it was impossible. My sunken eyes and sleepless nights didn't go unnoticed. One morning, he found me sitting on the bed, staring into nothing, unable to speak. "Alice, what's going on?" He tried to reassure me, but his voice was laced with concern. I wanted to tell him everything I was going through, but how could I explain that a presence, a woman who disappeared decades ago, was now haunting me? The dreams became more intense, and I started to feel that the veil I had put on in the church had somehow connected my soul to hers. My nights were haunted by the same figure, the same veil, the same whisper. And the worst part, each time she appeared, I felt she was getting closer, not just in the dreams, but in real life. Something was drawing her to me. Exhaustion consumed me. More and more, I would wake up in the middle of the night with the feeling that someone was standing at the foot of my bed, watching. I knew this wasn't just a dream. It was as if the missing bride was trying to tell me something, or take something from me. And as the days passed, the fear that she wanted something beyond my attention became impossible to ignore. The dreams and suffocating presence finally became unbearable. One sleepless and desperate night, I told Mark everything. I told him about the dreams, about the woman in the veil, and about the constant whisper in my ears. He tried to calm me down, saying that it was probably just our minds playing tricks on us because of the disturbing story we had discovered. But I knew it wasn't that simple. Something deeper was happening, something I could barely understand, but it was relentlessly chasing me. Mark, ever the skeptic, suggested we visit the church again, to face my fears. I was reluctant, but part of me knew we had to confront it head-on. Something needed to be resolved, and maybe by returning to the place where it all started, I could understand what the bride wanted. We returned to the church at dusk, the fading light giving the place an even more macabre atmosphere than the first time. The same oppressive silence greeted us, as if the church had been waiting for our return. The wind blew through the broken stained glass, carrying with it a distant echo of voices that seemed to whisper in the shadows. The veil I had worn weeks ago was still there, crumpled at the foot of the altar, dirty and torn. But now, it seemed more than just a piece of fabric. It seemed alive. As we walked toward the altar, I felt the air around us grow heavier. Mark tried to appear brave, but even he felt the shift in the atmosphere. The place was charged with an energy we couldn't explain. Suddenly, the whisper I had heard in my dreams seemed to take real form around us. It was as if the church itself was speaking. Then, something happened that I could never forget. The veil began to move. Slowly, it lifted from the ground, as if raised by invisible hands. The muffled sound of footsteps echoed through the empty hall, and without warning, the bride appeared. Her figure was even clearer than in the photos. She floated toward the altar, the veil covering her face, and I knew, without a doubt, that she was there for me. I never finished what I started. The voice echoed like a ripple through the cold walls of the church. Mark tried to pull me away, but I couldn't move. I felt that the veil now belonged to me, as if she had chosen me to finish her unfinished wedding. The terror I felt as I faced that figure, with her face hidden, was indescribable. I knew that, somehow, by putting on that veil, I had established a connection with her, a connection that was now taking its final form. Time seemed to stop. The bride hovered before me, the veil extending like a shroud of darkness, and I realized she wasn't trying to hurt me but to replace me. She needed a bride to complete what fate had denied her. With a strangled cry, I broke free from Mark and ran toward the church's exit. I knew that if I stayed, I would never be myself again. Mark followed, and together, we escaped from that place. But even after we left the church behind, the feeling that something was left unfinished still haunted me. The dreams didn't stop. The bride was still watching, waiting for the right moment. She still hadn't finished what she started, and maybe she never would. I never imagined that the place where my faith once blossomed could become a stage for so many dark secrets. Since my retirement, my days have been marked by a calm, almost monotonous routine. Even so, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The time I spent preaching in the small church of my youth, where so many souls came seeking comfort and guidance, lingered in my mind. The memories of those days were sweet, reminders of simpler times and a purer faith. That's when I decided to return, as though I needed to revisit that place, to reconnect with the past. The journey was quiet, and as I drove, the landscape around me seemed to shift subtly. What were once vibrant, life-filled fields now seemed desolate, as if time had eroded not just the church but everything around it. The trees were dry, and distant houses were covered in the dust of abandonment. When I finally saw the church in the distance, my heart jumped, but not with joy. The sight of it shocked me. I knew many years had passed, but I wasn't prepared for what I saw. The church's facade, which had once been impeccably white, was now covered in a thick layer of green and brown moss, as though nature itself was reclaiming the place. The windows, which once gloriously reflected sunlight, were now shattered, with pieces of glass scattered across the ground. The tower, which had always seemed so majestic and imposing, was leaning, as if on the verge of collapse. The place had turned into a ruin, a reflection of the passing of time, but also something deeper and darker. I parked the car in front of the rusted gate. Part of me wanted to turn back, but the other, the one that had brought me there, insisted I go inside. As dilapidated as it was, the church still held special meaning for me. It had been the place where my faith had flourished, where I had been inspired to follow my calling. Struggling against the sense of discomfort, I took my first steps through the gate, which screeched with the grating sound of metal scraping against the ground. I took a deep breath, inhaling the smell of dampness and wet earth. The silence around me was almost oppressive, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath, waiting for my reaction. The memories I cherished began to mingle with the sadness of the church's current state. Something was wrong there, something I couldn't yet define, but that already weighed heavily on my chest. As I opened the church's heavy door, the sound echoed through the main nave. The place was shrouded in shadows. Only a few beams of light passed through the dirty, broken stained glass windows, casting strange patterns on the stone floor. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of dust and old wood. It felt as if time had stopped inside, but at the same time, everything seemed to be slowly decomposing. I felt the weight of the environment on my shoulders, and the silence was so deep it seemed almost unnatural. I took a few hesitant steps inside, each one producing an echo that seemed louder than it should have been. The pews where the faithful once sat were in ruins, broken or covered in a thick layer of grime. As I looked around, a wave of nostalgia hit me. I remembered when the place had been full of life, with people praying, singing, seeking comfort in their prayers. Now, it felt as though everything had been left to rot. Even so, there was a strange familiarity, as if despite the decay, I could still feel the energy of the souls who had once been there. As I slowly walked down the central aisle, the cold in the air intensified. I remembered every detail of the church, the grand altar, the stained glass windows that filtered light in a unique way, the whispers of prayers. But now, everything seemed covered in a shadow I couldn't explain. My footsteps echoed as if they were the only sound left in that forgotten place. And in a way, they were. The church was empty, not just of people, but of life, of faith. It was as if the spirit that had once inhabited it had been stripped away. I approached the altar, where I had preached so many times. I remembered looking out at the congregation, feeling the energy of faith pulsating among us. Now, all I felt was cold and desolation. The altar, once shining, was now covered in dust. The candles were all extinguished, and the gold ornaments had lost their luster. The church felt like a tomb, a silent memorial to times that would never return. Yet, at the same time, I felt something in the air, as though an invisible presence was watching me. I continued my walk down the side aisles, passing by abandoned confessionals and doors that led to the sacristy. Each step felt heavier, as if the ground itself resisted my passage. And as I walked, a strange sense of discomfort began to grow inside me. Something about this place, something beyond the physical decay, seemed to be trying to push me away. But instead of leaving, I felt the need to continue. I needed to understand what had happened there, why this place, which had once been a refuge, now felt so dark and hostile. As I neared the sacristy, my heart began to race, as if something invisible was trying to stop me from going further. The sacristy had always been a place of calm, where priests prepared for Mass, where silent prayers were said before the most important moments in the life of our parish. But now, as I pushed open the heavy wooden door, I was met with even colder air and deeper darkness. The smell of mold was strong, as though the space had been locked up for years. I switched on the small flashlight I had brought with me, and its weak beam revealed dusty shelves with religious books stacked haphazardly. Yellowed pages were scattered across the floor, as if someone had dropped them in a hurry. I bent down to pick them up, feeling the rough, time-worn paper beneath my fingers. They were records of old parishioners, people who had frequented the church during my time as a young priest. I recognized some of the names, which brought a brief sense of familiarity, a reconnection to those distant days. But as I continued flipping through the papers, something began to bother me. Many of the records ended abruptly, without any explanation. It was as though, suddenly, these people had simply disappeared. There were no mentions of deaths, transfers, or any other common explanations. The records just stopped, as though the parishioners had ceased to exist overnight. This left me both intrigued and uneasy. Some of these names belonged to devout families who came to Mass every Sunday. How could there be no mention of what had happened to them? The sacristy, once a place of peace, now seemed filled with buried secrets. A heavier weight settled in my chest, a feeling that something was deeply wrong. I decided to investigate further, rummaging through drawers and shelves in search of answers. My fingers touched something hard and cold in one of the highest drawers, something covered in dust and forgotten in the back. I carefully pulled it out, revealing an old leather-bound book, its thick, faded pages worn with age. The title was illegible, but as I opened it, I realized it was a record of the priests who had served in the parish over the years. My hands trembled slightly as I leafed through the first pages. The book began routinely, with accounts of masses, confessions, and everyday activities of the church. But as I progressed through the pages, the entries grew darker. The priest who had written these records mentioned that in the later years of the parish, something had begun to change. There was a growing unease among the parishioners, an inexplicable fear that took hold of the people. Some spoke of feeling an evil presence, something the priests tried, unsuccessfully, to contain. Those words filled me with a sense of dread I hadn't expected to find there. My eyes scanned the pages with growing anxiety, and the space around me seemed to close in as I read. The accounts from the last priests were unlike anything I had encountered in my decades of service. They spoke of an oppressive feeling that grew stronger with time. They described how parishioners began to report strange visions during Mass, shadows moving in the corners of the church, whispers coming from nowhere. Most disturbing, however, were the reports about the sacristy, the very place where I stood. It was said that the presence was strongest there. I kept reading, my heavy breathing echoing in the empty space. The priests had tried everything to purify the place. Exorcisms, long prayers, even keeping the church closed for days to ward off whatever was there. But nothing worked. The fear only grew, and the parishioners' accounts became more vivid and desperate. Some of the most devout parishioners stopped attending Mass abruptly, claiming that something was watching them from the shadows during services. The book also mentioned that many parish records had been lost or deliberately erased, which explained the incomplete documents I had found. This revelation left a lump in my throat. The sudden disappearance of so many people I had known no longer seemed like a simple mystery. Something in this church had driven them away, something that couldn't be explained with conventional words. I continued reading, my heart tightening with each new page I turned. Then, one passage caught my eye. One of the priests wrote that in the final days of the parish, they had discovered something disturbing about the church bell. According to the entry, the bell wasn't just an ordinary religious object. The priests began to believe it had the power to call something evil, a presence that hovered around the place. They mentioned that after each toll of the bell, the air in the church would change, becoming denser, heavier. It was then decided that the only solution was to destroy it. This revelation left me speechless. The bell, which I had rung countless times to summon the faithful, now seemed at the center of a dark mystery. The decision to destroy it had been made in secret, and only the oldest priests were aware of the reason. The bell was dismantled and buried somewhere near the church, in the hope that without it, the evil influence surrounding the place would vanish. However, from what I was feeling now, reading those dusty pages, I knew that the evil they had tried to drive away was still present. I closed the book slowly, trying to process what I had just read. The feeling of something evil in the church wasn't a product of my imagination. It was real, and the priests who had come before me had felt it too. The church, which had once been a place of refuge, now felt like a gateway to something much darker. I needed to leave, but something was preventing me from simply walking away. Something was unfinished, and I felt that my presence there was no accident. The book left me more disturbed than I wanted to admit. The account of the church bell made me feel as though I was caught in something far greater than mere nostalgic memories. I had rung that bell countless times in the past, never imagining it could carry such a dark burden. The thought that the priest had decided to destroy it sent chills through me. The bell had been a symbol of calling the faithful, of uniting the community. Now, it seemed to be something that attracted not just the faithful, but something much more sinister. As I reflected on what I had read, I felt a strange urge to find some trace of the bell. I didn't know why, but something inside me told me I needed to fully understand what had happened here before I left. After all, why destroy the bell? Did they truly believe it had the power to summon something evil? And if so, what exactly did they think they were calling? The story felt incomplete, and the unanswered questions left me unsettled. I decided to leave the sacristy and explore the church tower, where the bell had once hung. Climbing the steps of the tower, I felt the weight of age in every stone. The wooden stairs creaked under my feet, and dust filled the air with each step. When I reached the top, I found myself staring at the place where the bell had once hung. Now, there was nothing there but an empty space, where the chains that had held the bell still swayed slightly, as though something invisible was tugging at them. The absence of the bell was unsettling. Even without it, its presence seemed to linger in the air. I stood there for a few minutes, staring at the void. The silence around me was almost deafening. For a moment, I thought I heard something, a very faint, distant sound, as though the bell were ringing somewhere. But I quickly convinced myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. It was impossible. The bell had been destroyed, buried somewhere in the church's surroundings, according to the records. But whatever it had called, according to the priests, still seemed to be present in some way. I descended the tower with a growing sense of urgency. I needed to leave the church, but at the same time, something continued to pull me back. There were more secrets buried there than I could bear. I walked slowly toward the main nave, trying to stay calm. The silence, which had once felt familiar, now felt oppressive. It was as though the building itself was breathing around me, waiting for something. I knew I couldn't stay much longer. Something was about to happen, and I needed to be far away when it did. I decided it was time to go. The church, which had once represented so much peace for me, now seemed suffocated by something much darker. But as I walked toward the door, I felt a strange presence around me, as though something, or someone, was watching me. My footsteps echoed through the empty corridors, and the sound of my shoes against the stone floor seemed much louder than it should have been. Every movement I made was accompanied by a growing sense that I was no longer alone. That's when I heard it. Soft footsteps, echoing behind me. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, a result of being immersed in such a place filled with history and mystery. But the footsteps were constant, rhythmic, as though someone was following me closely. I stopped for a moment and slowly turned my head, expecting to see the empty corridor behind me. But it wasn't empty. In the shadows, I saw something move, shadows that shouldn't have been there, weaving between the broken pews and advancing toward me. My heart raced. The shadows seemed to move with a purpose, sliding between the pews as though hunting me. I tried to stay calm, convincing myself it was just the play of light and darkness confusing me. Maybe the decrepit state of the windows and the way the weak light filtered through them were creating those shapes. But deep down, I knew it wasn't an illusion. I was no longer alone. The shadows were there, and they were following me. I began to walk faster toward the exit. The sound of my footsteps mixed with the echo of footsteps that didn't belong to me. Every moment, the feeling that something was closing in on me grew stronger. The shadows seemed to take shape, like human figures made of darkness, floating through the gloom. For a moment, fear overwhelmed me, and I felt my legs grow heavy, as though the very ground was trying to hold me in place. I couldn't look back anymore. I knew that if I did, I might see something I wasn't prepared to face. I prayed silently as I hurried toward the door. My prayers, however, seemed to have no effect. The feeling of being watched didn't disappear, and the footsteps continued to echo behind me. When I finally reached the door, a momentary wave of relief washed over me. I was about to leave that place, but as I placed my hand on the rusty doorknob, a chill ran down my spine. The air around me was freezing, as though the life had been drained from the church. Something didn't want me to leave. When my hand touched the doorknob, the cold metal seemed to burn my skin. I hesitated for a moment, unable to force my fingers to turn it. The air around me grew heavier, thicker, as though the church itself was alive, holding me inside. I knew I needed to leave, but something, an invisible force, an ancient presence, seemed determined to keep me there. I took a deep breath, gathering all the courage I had left, and finally opened the door. The creak echoed through the church, but instead of bringing relief, it brought an even greater wave of terror. I felt the shadows moving closer. I didn't need to look back to know they were there, drawing nearer, as though feeding on my fear. I stepped into the main corridor, trying to walk quickly, but my legs felt heavy, as though the dense air was pressing down on my body. Each step was a monumental effort, and I knew that if I stopped, something or someone would catch up to me. The sound of footsteps behind me grew louder, sharper. It was no longer just my imagination. As I walked through the corridors, my memories of youth began to blur with the dark reality unfolding before me. The shadows weren't just amorphous figures. They seemed to take shape, vaguely human, with slow, deliberate movements. And then, I realized something even more disturbing. Those figures were the souls who had disappeared from the church all those years ago. The incomplete records, the lives that had vanished without explanation, they were all connected to the evil presence now haunting the church. The shadows were what remained of them, trapped there, waiting for someone to free them, or perhaps waiting for another soul to add to their number. My mind was in turmoil. The evil the old priests had tried to banish still inhabited the church, and those lost souls had been consumed by it. The prayers and exorcisms I had read about in the records hadn't been enough to contain it, and now, after all this time, the force that resided in the church had grown even stronger. I felt the gaze of the shadows on me, heavy and cold, as though they were waiting for me to join them. My hands trembled, and every prayer I whispered seemed swallowed by the oppressive silence of the church. I knew my time was running out. The sense that something was still unfinished was almost palpable. The priests had tried to seal away the evil by destroying the bell, but now I knew it hadn't been enough. The evil still roamed there, waiting for unsuspecting souls, ready to claim more lives. I needed to leave, but with every step toward the exit, the weight of that unresolved past became more unbearable. It was as if the church itself was telling me that once you entered, you could never truly leave. With a strength I didn't know I had, I ran toward the exit. My feet felt heavy, as though something invisible was trying to pull me back, but I kept moving forward. The sound of footsteps behind me grew louder, as though the shadows had quickened their pace. The air was so thick that breathing became a painful effort. I prayed as I ran, begging for protection, pleading for God to allow me to leave that place with my soul intact. Each step felt like a battle against the forces trying to hold me prisoner. Finally, I reached the church's door. The fading light outside seemed distant, almost unreal, but I knew that if I could just make it through that door, I would be safe. I turned the doorknob with all the strength I had, and the door, heavy and rusted, opened with a long, agonizing creak. I stumbled out, nearly falling on the stone steps, but I kept running until I was a safe distance from the church. Only when I felt the fresh air on my face did I realize I had made it out, but the relief didn't come right away. Even outside, I still felt the church's gaze on me, as though something was following me. I looked back at the broken windows and crumbling structure. From where I stood, the shadows inside the church still seemed to be moving, silently drifting between the pews, watching me from afar. They hadn't followed me outside, but I knew I wasn't truly free. Something had been left unfinished, and that feeling consumed me. I tried to shake the fear with prayers, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw those shadows, those lost souls who had never left the church. The evil that inhabited that place hadn't been defeated by the priests who came before me, and now I carried the weight of that truth. They had tried to prevent the bell from calling whatever lurked in the darkness, but the bell had only been a symbol. Whatever inhabited the church was beyond physical objects. It was a presence that could never be fully contained. Even outside the church, I felt I wasn't alone. The silence around me, the cold air, all seemed to tell me that somehow, The evil that haunted that place knew I had been there. No matter how far I went, what I had seen and felt in that church would follow me forever. The shadows didn't need to leave the church to reach me. They were now a part of me, a reminder of what I had left behind and of what could have been my own downfall. I looked toward the horizon and began to walk, knowing that even though I had physically left the church, a part of me was still trapped inside. The evil that haunted the church hadn't been defeated, and perhaps never would be. Now, it was aware of me, and that awareness weighed on me more than any sermon I had ever preached in my youth. The past of that parish hadn't been forgotten, nor would it ever be.